You've heard of gladiators and samurai. Fine. But can you name the civilization that perfected slow-rotting poison arrows? Or the one that ripped down city walls with handheld demolition tools? If not, buckle up. History is about to get mean. Sumerians, siege axes. The first recorded border war in history was not about honor or destiny, it was about farmland. The city-state of Umma wanted a strip of fertile land called Guedina, and Lagash said, absolutely not. There was already a treaty carved in stone that told Umma to stay off the property, but this was early Mesopotamia. Treaty basically meant temporary suggestion, so Umma ignored it and walked in anyway. Lagash did not send diplomats, they sent King Eannatum, a man who thought conflict resolution involved an axe and a marching formation. This is where the story shifts from neighbor dispute to world's first siege tutorial. Most people think early Bronze Age warfare was just farmers with blades bumping into each other in an open field. Not here. Lagash rolled out a professional infantry line with shields, formations, and a new star player. The siege axe, a thick copper blade mounted on a long shaft, heavy enough to crack mud brick fortifications. The big idea was simple. Why climb walls when you can remove the wall from the argument? Eannatum marched on Umma's defenses, and instead of standing around shouting insults, his troops hacked straight into the outer section of the fortification. Mud brick may survive the desert, but it does not survive 200 angry men swinging reinforced bronze hardware. The walls crumbled, the morale cracked faster than the bricks, and Umma learned that Lagash did not do gentle reminders. This is the battle shown on the Stele of the Vultures, one of the oldest war monuments ever carved. It shows Lagash's infantry packed shoulder to shoulder, moving like a solid block. Early phalanx, no fancy poetry, it is basically a stone comic strip that says, here is Lagash, here is the wall, here is the part where it no longer exists. The siege worked because this was not a quick raid. Lagash brought logistics, formations, water carriers, and tool crews. These were not farmers caught in a tantrum. This was organized violence with office hours. And the axes were not little hand tools. Archaeologists have found thick copper blades with narrow points designed to punch into layered mud brick before ripping downward. Think demolition bar, Bronze Age edition. Most people imagine swords as the weapon of early heroics, but here the sword is just the opening act. The real star was the thing that killed buildings before it killed people. When the wall opened, Umma broke. The troops rushed in and turned the fight into street-level cleanup. Eannatum then forced the surviving rulers of Umma to sign another treaty, and this time he carved it into multiple stones across the territory, so they would have to walk past a reminder of their defeat every morning on the way to breakfast. Redemption arc denied. The fascinating part is how early this happened in history. This is 1,000 years before chariots became military fashion. This is before iron. This is before big imperial warfare. And already one city had figured out, why fight defenders when you can just delete the defense? This siege became a blueprint. Other city-states took notes. Once people saw what a reinforced axe could do to a mud brick wall, everyone realized walls were only useful until someone showed up with real motivation. Lagash also used intimidation tactics. After the victory, Eannatum made sure the enemy corpses were displayed in ways that doubled as a press release. Here lies everyone who thought treaties were optional. Subtlety was not a known technology yet. What makes this fight stand out is that it is fully documented, not legend. We are not guessing. The Stele of the Vultures literally shows the formation, the king, and the aftermath. Clay tablets record the land dispute. Archaeology recovered the weapon designs. This is not mythic Homeric storytelling. This is Mesopotamian paperwork with an axe-based ending. It also reveals how advanced Sumerian warfare already was. They had rank structure, marching drills, shield lines, and breaching crews almost 2,500 years before Rome tried the same idea with masonry upgrades. People joke about early civilizations learning violence slowly, but the Sumerians jumped straight to urban demolition project. The wall breaching tactic also mattered because it replaced the old idea of starving cities out. Eannatum looked at the calendar and said, why wait 3 months when we can fix the wall problem today? It was faster, cheaper, and terrifying. And once a tactic proves itself, everyone copies it. This is how siege warfare became a standard part of war instead of a desperate last choice. One smashed wall and half of Mesopotamia said, okay, we do this now. Umma's army survived the battle, but their pride did not. Nothing says you lost, like signing a carved legal notice explaining how you are not allowed to touch your own backyard. Guedina stayed under Lagash control, and the rest of Mesopotamia learned a new truth. Early kings ruled by divine favor, but they enforced it with hardware. Hittites, war chariots. The Egyptians marched into Syria thinking they were about to flex on a smaller kingdom. Ramses II rode out like he already had the victory statue commissioned. Then he reached Kadesh and learned a lesson that should be carved into stone. Never assume you are the only one bringing horsepower. The Hittites were already there, waiting, hiding, and not with a cute scouting party. With around 2,500 heavy chariots packed behind a ridge like a Bronze Age jump scare. Ramses thought he had a surprise inspection. The Hittites planned a surprise demolition. This was not the dainty archer taxi that textbooks show. The Hittite chariot was basically a three-man battering ram with wheels. One man drove. One man threw javelins or shot arrows. The third existed to ruin someone's afternoon up close. It had a center-mounted axle for stability, so it could smash into infantry instead of tipping over like Egypt's lighter two-man version. Egypt brought mobility. The Hittites brought physics. The Hittite king, Muwatalli II, sat safely north of the city with backup infantry, because why risk your royal neck when you can let 5,000 horses make your point for you? Ramses, on the other hand, camped with only part of his army because he had marched ahead of his own support columns. He basically walked into a boss fight without waiting for his teammates to load in. The attack hit the Egyptian camp so fast that Egyptian scribes later tried to spin it as a heroic comeback. Translation: we got wrecked, and then we lied about it on papyrus. The Hittite charge turned the campsite into airborne tent parts in panic. Lines broke. Soldiers scattered. Even elite bodyguards were suddenly reconsidering their career plans. The Hittite tactic was simple and evil. Slam the front lines, break formation, then run straight through the baggage train to cut off organization. A normal chariot stops after impact. A Hittite chariot keeps going and rolls over whatever is still breathing. You are not just defeated. You are flattened. The Egyptians who survived the first hit tried to regroup. The problem? There were more chariots coming from the same ridge. This was not a charge. This was traffic with a kill count. Ramses eventually gathered what remained of his personal guard and fought back long enough to stall the bleeding. Egyptian tablet accounts claim he fought like a god. Sure, he also fought like a man who almost got turned into decorative terrain. The only reason the Egyptians weren't erased from the map that day is because a contingent of mercenaries called the Nerin finally arrived and crashed into the Hittite rear. Ancient world translation: surprise third party. At this point, both armies were exhausted. The Hittites had smashed the camp but could not finish the cleanup because the chariots had outrun their infantry support. Ramses got to breathe again, not because of flawless leadership, mostly because the Hittite shock attack worked too well and broke formation even faster than the enemy. This is what makes Kadesh so brutal historically. It is the first recorded moment where a weapon system behaved like a modern armored charge. Not just riders, not just archers, not just intimidation. A combined weapons vehicle 3,000 years before the word vehicle existed. And people still think early war was primitive. No. This was a Bronze Age tank rush. The Egyptians claimed victory in inscriptions because winners write history and sore winners write bigger. But the truth is more boring and more human. Both sides looked at the battlefield, checked who was still upright, and realized continuing would turn the valley into a meat blender. So they stopped, called it even, and made a treaty later. The first surviving international peace treaty in history exists because everyone was too tired to die here twice. The Hittites didn't need a moral victory. They had demonstrated the real point. Whoever controls mobility controls survival. Foot soldiers in a neat formation look great until a three-man horse-driven sledgehammer turns them into an archaeology layer. The most overlooked part? The Hittites engineered this. They designed their chariot for weight. They weren't improvising. They weren't copying Egypt. Egypt had speed. The Hittites built momentum. A lighter chariot is a racing cart. A heavier one is a guided accident. Guess which one breaks bones more reliably? Archaeologists found reinforced hubs, thicker spokes, and heavier rails on Hittite reconstructions. This thing wasn't elegant. It was committed. You could almost hear the design meeting. What if transportation, but also skull fracture? Shang, China, dagger axes. When people think early Chinese warfare was elegant, they have never met the Shang war machine. The Shang kingdom was not a heroic dynasty with noble duels. It was a bronze-powered grinder that treated enemies like raw material. The dagger axe was not a weapon, it was a production tool for shortening lifespans. The city of Anyang was the Shang capital, and its workshops were basically the Bronze Age version of a weapons factory. Archaeologists have uncovered casting pits stacked with molds, scrap, slag, and finished blades. Thousands of them. These were not rare prestige items. These were inventory. The standard was the G, a dagger axe blade mounted sideways on a long pole. A spear thrust pierces. A sword slashes. The G rips you open, then rearranges your life choices. It hooks the neck, pulls the body off balance, and turns your spine into a liability. Shang troops fought in close lines, sweeping sideways like harvesters. You were not an enemy, you were a crop. This system was not improvisation. Oracle bone records tracked troop numbers like cattle. Mobilizations were logged as if they were grain shipments. Deploy 3,000 read like check storage. Human life was a line item, the army was a conveyor belt, and the Shang made good use of it. When rival tribes resisted, they did not negotiate. They rolled out a row of bronze hatchets, declared a field test, and called it war. The dagger axe favored reach and removal. It could break limbs, drag you to the ground, or finish you before you realized you were done. The soldiers did not need honor speeches. They needed an open field and time. The mass production behind it is the disturbing part. Excavations show dedicated bronze foundries, not artisanal smiths. They poured weapons in batches. They standardized molds for faster duplication. They turned killing into logistics. Footage of an assembly line would not feel out of place. Just swap conveyor belts for mud brick furnaces and human suffering. This wasn't bravery on horseback. The Shang barely used cavalry. They used volume. When a force marches in blocks of thousands, armed with weapons designed to unbutton your skeleton, style points are unnecessary. The dagger axe had another purpose: prisoners. If you lost a battle, congratulations. Your future job title was ritual supply. The Shang did not throw away leftovers. War captives became sacrifices or labor, depending on demand. Anyang's temple pits still hold human remains stacked like construction debris. The dagger axe created inventory. The priesthood processed it. This is where most people misunderstand early China. They imagine philosophy first and warfare second. But this was the era before Confucius existed to say, maybe do not vaporize the neighbors. The Shang believed their king ruled because heaven said so, and every corpse was proof of the subscription renewal. The weapon's design fits the worldview. A sword suggests honor. A bow suggests distance. The G says, I am here to remove parts of you that you are still using. It is personal, fast, and designed to ensure you do not stand back up. A battlefield full of dagger axes does not create prisoners. It creates leftovers. The scale is the real horror. Other civilizations boasted courage. The Shang boasted throughput. They did not refine fighting styles. They refined output per hour. If the Hittite chariot was a wrecking ball, the Shang army was a combine harvester. At Anyang, archaeologists have recovered not dozens of weapons, but armories worth. Rows of cast blades. Identical. This is not hero culture. It is a spreadsheet sharpened into metal. Assyrians. Iron blades. Before the Assyrians became famous for wiping cities off the map, they had to invent their favorite warm-up act, fear. And the man who turned fear into a government department was Ashurnasirpal II. He didn't just use weapons to win battles. He used reputation to make sure half the enemies surrendered before the blades ever touched them. Iron was the tool. Terror was the payload. By this period, the Assyrians had moved beyond bronze. Bronze dents, iron bites, bronze cracks, iron survives. The Assyrian army carried iron-edged swords, iron spearheads, and iron-headed maces, and that already made them a nightmare. But iron is not the reason the neighbors panicked. The reason was what Ashurnasirpal did after the fighting stopped. His own royal inscriptions brag about it. He had scribes permanently carve his war resume into palace walls. Not, I won the battle. More like, I won the battle, and then turned the survivors into interior decor. He flayed rebels alive and hung their skins from city gates like warning posters. He stacked bodies into pyramids outside captured strongholds. He made losing visible from a mile away. This wasn't rage, this was marketing. Most kings threatened destruction. Ashurnasirpal made a case study out of it. When a city resisted tribute, he didn't negotiate. He marched there, cracked open the defenses, and held a public demonstration of the consequences of not paying your protection fee. His soldiers did the killing. The royal masons handled the messaging. And behind all this was the iron blade, a weapon that stayed sharp through bone, armor, and dignity. On the battlefield, these blades cut through bronze shields that other kingdoms still relied on. Bronze loses an argument with iron every time. When Assyrian infantry hit a line, the enemy could hear the difference, metal snapping, not ringing. That sound is how you know your life choices are expiring. But the iron wasn't the scary part. The follow-up was, Ashurnasirpal didn't conquer cities to rule them gently. He conquered them to make examples. He wrote about cutting off noses, ears, hands, and heads, not as cruelty, but as documentation. He wanted the next city to hear about it before his army even appeared over the horizon. If people surrendered out of fear, great. If not, they joined the wall decor. This turned warfare into a psychological economy. Fight us, die creatively. Obey us, keep your skin. Congratulations, you are now participating in empire building. And this strategy worked. When the army marched, most towns did not even bother fighting. They opened the gates early and walked out holding loyalty as an apology. Imagine losing a war before the first arrow launches because the last guy who tried to resist got converted into wallpaper. Even Assyrian military structure reflected this. The soldiers were not heroic champions. They were industrial-grade cutters. Advance, strike, break the line, move to the next target. No speeches, no flair. Once the blade does its job, the propaganda department finishes it. Iron made it efficient, terror made it permanent. One Assyrian inscription reads like, "A shopping list of suffering. I cut off their heads. I built a pillar. I flayed the chiefs and draped their skins." That is not metaphor. That is a direct translation of the king's own PR release. If LinkedIn existed, his profile headline would read, CEO of Psychological Compliance. Other kings wanted glory. Ashurnasirpal wanted silence, preferably from an entire province at once. His empire expanded not through diplomacy but through the expectation of consequences. When a kingdom knows what the end looks like, surrender becomes a survival instinct. The terrifying part is the orderliness. This wasn't chaos. This was procedure. Kill first, display second, record third, move on. Everything about his campaigns feels administrative. The scribes carved pain like it was a quarterly earnings report. And all of this started with the iron blade. Without a weapon that could chew through bronze armor and not shatter in the process, the intimidation campaign wouldn't land. The violence had to look inevitable. Iron made the army unstoppable. Fear made the aftermath unforgettable. Archaeology backs all of this. Assyrian relief carvings from Nimrud show impaled prisoners, flayed rebels, chained captives, kneeling under recording scribes. The blade appears in almost every panel, not as heroism, but as policy enforcement. The art is not subtle about its purpose. It is basically an ancient billboard saying, "Ask about our loyalty discounts." Scythians, poison arrows. Some warriors kill you quickly. The Scythians killed you on a timer. Getting hit by one of their arrows was not, you die on the spot. It was, your body starts negotiating with bacteria, venom, and regret. If the Assyrians terrified people before the blade landed, the Scythians terrified people after it did. They were horse archers, fast and hard to catch, and everyone assumed the danger was the arrow itself. No. The danger was the second act, the part your immune system wasn't invited to survive. Greek writers, especially Herodotus, could not stop describing it. The Scythians dipped their arrowheads in a stew of putrefying animal blood, venom from vipers, and decomposed flesh left to rot in the sun. They created an early version of biological warfare, using the world's worst marinade. If the arrow didn't kill you, the infection signed the paperwork. The wound swelled, blackened, and turned into a countdown. You didn't get mercy. You got decay with guest appearances from sepsis, necrosis, and despair. Congratulations, you are not dead yet. You are dying in episodes. They didn't fire one arrow in hope. They hit you once, then backed off to watch your body clock out at its own pace. Other civilizations used iron, numbers, walls, or chariots. The Scythians used biology. And they weaponized suffering like it was a subscription service. This wasn't sloppy improvisation. They engineered it. Archaeological digs found arrows with barbed heads meant to lodge inside the wound, so removal ripped the flesh wider. A Scythian arrow didn't want to exit. It wanted to settle in and ruin your week. The poison mixture came from a process so disgusting that even historians describing it sounded tired. They buried venomous snakes until they rotted, scraped the sludge, mixed it with blood and dung, then sealed it in leather containers until it fermented into industrial misery. The tactic fit their warfare style perfectly. The Scythians rarely stood in place and fought big cinematic battles. They harassed, hit flanks, and punished pursuit. Regular armies expected a kill or be killed duel. The Scythians preferred kill and let infection finish the paperwork. Their archery wasn't about penetration. It was delivery. Greek accounts describe soldiers surviving the arrow strike, only to rot in place days later, screaming while the rest of the army learned a new respect for distance. Even hardened infantry realized that winning meant nothing if the follow-up was amputation or a slow audition for the grave. This is why neighboring kingdoms feared them even when they weren't present on the battlefield. The wound itself became propaganda. You could look at an injured survivor and see tomorrow's forecast. Increasing gangrene with a heavy chance of burial. Unlike the Assyrians, the Scythians didn't need terror inscriptions or palace art. Their victims became the message. One limping survivor was worth 100 carved warnings. The sight alone translated across every language on earth. You do not want this smoke. When Scythian cavalry fired, soldiers didn't just dodge to avoid pain. They dodged to avoid the sequel. And that changed combat morale in a way no chariot charge or iron sword ever could. Death is normal. Rotting alive is personal. Even the anatomy of their tactics feels cruelly efficient. Strike from range. Withdraw before counterattack. Let bacteria do the heavy lifting. The soldier who got hit wouldn't slow the battle immediately, but he would slow his camp, his retreat, his morale, and eventually his heartbeat. The poison was not just a weapon. It was a delayed siege inside the bloodstream. And unlike most ancient armies who needed engineers, the Scythians needed weather and time. A cooler climate slowed decay, so they sometimes stored venom in warm pits to keep fermentation active. Imagine designing your arsenal around humidity. That is commitment.